The dust had barely settled on the road when Sarah Porter's life collapsed in on itself, like a house of cards in a storm. The blood came first, then the pain, and finally the terrible, hollow emptiness that told her what she already knew in her heart: the child growing inside her for the past 5 months was gone. It was 1878 in Bandera, Texas, a cattle town nestled in the hill country where Sarah had staked her claim on a new beginning just over a year ago. The promise of that new beginning now lay in shreds around her as she huddled on the floor of her small cabin, arms wrapped around her middle as if she could somehow hold everything together through sheer force of will. Xavier Young found her there as the afternoon sun cast long shadows through the single window. He hadn't meant to come calling that day. As the foreman of the neighboring Cross T ranch, he'd been busy with spring calving and the 1,000 other tasks that demanded his attention. But something, instinct perhaps, or divine providence, had pulled him toward the Porter homestead just as Sarah's world was crumbling. "Sarah." His voice carried across the threshold as he knocked on the half-open door. The sounds coming from within turned his blood cold, raw, primal sobs that seemed wrenched from the very depths of human suffering. He found her curled on the wooden floor, her simple calico dress stained with blood, her chestnut hair falling in disarray around her face as her body shook with grief. Xavier dropped to his knees beside her, his usual stoic demeanor giving way to panic. "My God, Sarah, what's happened? Are you hurt? Should I fetch the doctor?" She looked up at him with eyes so haunted they barely seemed human. "It's gone," she whispered. "The baby's gone." Understanding dawned like a cruel sunrise. He'd known about her condition, though they'd never spoken of it directly. The whole town knew that Sarah Porter had arrived in Bandera as a widow, only to discover 2 months later that her late husband had left her with child. She'd held her head high despite the whispers, determined to build a life for herself and her baby. Xavier's calloused hands hovered helplessly over her, afraid to touch, afraid to make things worse. He was a man accustomed to fixing problems, mending fences, breaking horses, managing men. But this was beyond his power to repair. "I'll get Doc Miller," he said, already rising to his feet. "No," her hand shot out, grabbing his wrist with surprising strength. "It's too late. There's nothing to be done now." He settled back down, uncertain, his tall frame awkward in the small space between the table and the stove. "You're still bleeding. You need help, Sarah. I need." Her voice broke, fresh tears coursing down her face. "I don't know what I need anymore." Xavier removed his hat and set it aside, a gesture of respect in the face of her grief. Then he did the only thing he could think to do. He sat down beside her, his back against the wall, and simply remained present as she wept. Minutes stretched into hours. The sunlight faded, and shadows lengthened across the floor. Still, Sarah cried, sometimes in silent tears that tracked down her pale cheeks, other times in gut-wrenching sobs that shook her slender frame. Xavier rose once to stoke the fire and light a lamp, and another time to bring her water, but otherwise he maintained his vigil, speaking not a word. When the moon had risen high enough to cast silver light through the window, Sarah's tears finally subsided enough for her to speak. "You should go," she said, her voice raw. "You've sat here all day watching me fall apart." Xavier looked at her steadily, his eyes the deep blue of a mountain lake. "Grieve as long as needed," he said simply. "There's no shame in it." Those words, so plain, so unadorned with false comfort or empty promises, broke something open inside her. Sarah looked at the man beside her, really looked at him perhaps for the first time since she'd come to Bandar. Xavier Young was known throughout the county as a man of few words but steady action. His broad shoulders and weathered face spoke of years under the Texas sun, but his eyes held a gentleness that belied his rugged exterior. "I thought I had more time," she said, the words spilling out now. "I thought I could prepare everything, make it right somehow. I've been sewing baby clothes at night, saving every penny." Her hand drifted to her stomach. "I never even felt it kick. Is that strange? I kept waiting for that moment, and now it will never come." Xavier didn't rush to fill the silence with platitudes. He simply nodded, acknowledging her loss. "My mother lost 3 between me and my sister. She said each one took a piece of her heart with them." "Did she ever get those pieces back?" "No," he answered honestly. "But she said her heart grew new pieces, different ones. Said it was like a quilt with patches not perfect, but still whole enough to keep you warm." Sarah leaned her head back against the wall, suddenly exhausted beyond measure. "I don't know if I have the strength to patch anything right now." "You don't have to," Xavier said. "Not today, not tomorrow, maybe not for a long while." The simple permission to be broken undid her again, and fresh tears came. Xavier hesitated, then awkwardly put his arm around her shoulders. She stiffened at first, then gradually leaned into his warmth, taking comfort in the solid presence of another human being who asked nothing of her except to exist in her grief. Xavier stayed through the night, dozing in a chair while Sarah finally slept on her narrow bed. In the gray light of dawn, he built up the fire again and made coffee, then stepped outside to tend to his horse, which had patiently waited through the night. When he returned, Sarah was sitting up, her face washed clean, her hair combed back and tied with a ribbon. "You didn't have to stay," she said, accepting the cup of coffee he offered. "I know." His eyes met hers steadily. "I'll ride for Doc Miller now if you'll allow it." She nodded, too tired to argue anymore. "Thank you, Xavier." He paused at the door, hat in hand. "I'll be back to check on you if that's all right." Something flickered in her eyes, perhaps the first tiny ember of hope in a sea of desolation. "I'd appreciate that." True to his word, Xavier returned that evening with Dr. Miller's wife, Hannah, who brought food and clean linens. The next day, he came again, this time with tools to fix her leaky roof, a task he'd noticed needed attention months ago, but had never felt it was his place to mention. The day after that, he brought a young milk cow. "She's extra from the Cross T," he explained as Sarah stared at the gentle-eyed Jersey. "More trouble than she's worth, according to the boss, but she gives sweet milk." Sarah knew it was a lie. The Cross T ran beef cattle, not dairy cows, and this animal had clearly been purchased specifically for her. "Xavier, I can't call her a loan then," he said, already setting up a small pen beside her cabin. "You can pay me back when you're feeling stronger." For 2 weeks, Xavier came every day, sometimes just for a few minutes to deliver firewood or fresh eggs from Hannah Miller's hens. Other times staying longer to help with chores Sarah found difficult in her weakened state. He never once mentioned the baby she had lost, but neither did he shy away when she spoke of it, which she did more frequently as the sharpest edges of her grief began to dull. "I was going to name her Elizabeth, after my mother," she told him one evening as they sat on her small porch, watching fireflies rise from the meadow grass. "Or William if it was a boy, though I was certain it was a girl." Xavier nodded, whittling a small piece of cedar with his pocket knife. The sweet scent of the wood filled the air between them. "Good names, both of them." "I keep thinking about who she might have become," Sarah continued. "What color her eyes would have been, whether she would have had her father's laugh." Xavier's knife paused for just a moment. It was the first time Sarah had mentioned her late husband in his presence. "I reckon she would have had your spirit," he said after a beat. "Would have been a force to be reckoned with." Sarah smiled faintly. "Is that what you think I am, a force?" "Yes, madam." "You came out here alone, staked your claim, built this place up from nothing. Takes a special kind of courage." Sarah looked around at her modest homestead, the small cabin, the vegetable garden just beginning to sprout, the chicken coop Xavier had helped her build the previous week. It wasn't much, but it was hers. Or at least, it had been meant to be hers and her child's. "I don't feel very courageous," she admitted. "Most days I feel like I'm just barely holding on." Xavier's hands were steady as he continued his carving. Holding on is its own kind of courage, especially when letting go would be easier. As spring gave way to the heat of summer, Sarah slowly found her way back to something resembling normal life. The bleeding stopped, and her body began to heal, though her heart remained tender as a fresh bruise. She resumed her work, taking in mending and laundry from the townspeople of Bandera, a skill that had kept her afloat since her arrival. Xavier's visits became less about necessity and more about choice. He would come by in the evenings when his work at the Cross T was done, sometimes bringing a rabbit he'd snared or fish he'd caught in the Medina River. They would sit on her porch as the heat of the day dissipated, talking about everything and nothing: the weather, the town gossip, books they had read. Sarah learned that beneath Xavier's quiet exterior lay a curious mind and unexpected depths. He had been educated in St. Louis until his father's death had called him back to Texas at 17. He could quote Shakespeare and calculate complex figures in his head with equal ease. When she expressed surprise at his knowledge of literature, he smiled sheepishly and pulled a dog-eared copy of the Odyssey from his saddlebag. "Man can't live on cattle and cards alone," he said with a shrug. One evening in July, as they sat shelling peas from Sarah's garden, she realized with a start that she had gone an entire day without crying. The thought brought both relief and a strange new guilt, as if moving forward somehow dishonored the child she had lost. Xavier seemed to sense her sudden shift in mood. "What is it?" he asked, his hands never pausing in their task. Sarah hesitated, then decided on honesty. "I was just thinking that I didn't cry today, not once, and it made me feel like I'm forgetting." Xavier was quiet for a long moment. "My pa used to say grief is like a river," he finally said. "At first, it's a flash flood, wild and dangerous, sweeping away everything in its path. But over time, it carves a channel, becomes something you can live alongside without drowning in it every day." He looked at her with those steady blue eyes. "Doesn't mean the river isn't still there." Sarah nodded, absorbing his words. "Your father sounds like he was a wise man in some ways, foolish in others." A rare smile crossed Xavier's face. "Like most of us, I suppose. What was he like?" "Your father," Xavier's hands stilled. "Hardworking, demanding, fair mostly. Not a man who found it easy to show affection, but you always knew where you stood with him." He resumed his shelling. "He came west after the war with nothing but the clothes on his back and built the Cross T from scratch. I always admired that about him." "Is that why you stay? To honor his legacy?" Xavier considered this. "Partly, but also because I love this land. It gets in your blood after a while, the open spaces, the way the light changes over the hills, even the damned heat." He glanced at her. "What about you? What brought you to Bandera of all places?" Sarah had told pieces of her story before, but never the whole of it. Something about the peaceful evening and Xavier's steady presence made her want to unburden herself completely. "My husband, Thomas, was killed in a mining accident in Colorado. We'd been married just under 2 years." She kept her eyes on her work, mechanically popping peas from their pods. "He was a dreamer, always chasing the next opportunity. We moved 3 times in those 2 years, each time with promises that this would be the place where we'd strike it rich." Xavier listened silently, giving her space to continue. "After he died, I found out he'd mortgaged everything we owned and borrowed heavily besides. The creditors took it all, right down to my mother's silver teaspoon." Her voice remained steady, though the memory still stung. "I had a cousin who'd settled in San Antonio. She wrote once about how beautiful the hill country was, so I scraped together what little I had left and came south. Bandera was as far as my money would take me." "And then you discovered you were carrying his child," Xavier said softly. Sarah nodded. "2 months after I arrived. It was unexpected. Thomas and I had been trying since we married with no success. I thought perhaps I couldn't have children." Her throat tightened. "Turns out I was right after all." Xavier set aside his bowl of peas and reached across the space between them to take her hand. His palm was warm and calloused against her skin. "One loss doesn't define what's possible, Sarah." She looked down at their joined hands, surprised by how natural it felt. "The doctor said the same. Still, it's hard not to see it as some kind of sign. If you're looking for signs, I'd say surviving out here on your own shows a whole lot more about what's possible for you than anything else." The conversation shifted then to lighter topics, but something had changed between them. A door had been opened, allowing for a new level of honesty that hadn't existed before. As summer blazed on, Sarah found herself looking forward to Xavier's visits with an anticipation that both excited and frightened her. She told herself it was simply gratitude for his friendship during the darkest period of her life, but in quiet moments, she admitted there was more to it. The way her pulse quickened when she heard his horse approach, the care she took with her appearance before he arrived, the lingering warmth in her chest long after he'd gone. Xavier, for his part, gave no clear indication of his feelings beyond his consistent presence and the kindness he showed her. If his gaze sometimes rested on her a moment longer than necessary, or if his hand occasionally brushed hers when passing a plate or tool, Sarah didn't allow herself to read too much into it. After all, she was still a woman in mourning, her body and heart still healing from profound loss. In late August, Bandera held its annual harvest festival, a tradition that brought together ranchers, farmers, and townspeople from miles around for 2 days of competitions, music, food, and trading. Sarah had avoided last year's festival, being new in town and uncomfortable with the attention her solitary status had already garnered. This year, however, Xavier persuaded her to attend. "The whole county will be there," he told her as they walked back from Sunday services, the Texas heat making the air shimmer around them. "Best time to sell those fancy handkerchiefs you've been embroidering." Sarah had indeed been creating delicate embroidered handkerchiefs and other small items in the evenings, hoping to supplement her income from laundry and mending. "I'm not sure I'm ready for so much socializing," she said hesitantly. Xavier studied her face. "Too soon." She appreciated that he didn't try to push or convince her. "Perhaps not too soon, just daunting. I haven't been in a crowd since." "I understand." He walked silently beside her for several paces, then said, "What if I were to help?" "You could set up a small table near Hannah Miller's preserve stand. I'd make sure you weren't overwhelmed." The idea of having Xavier nearby made the prospect considerably less intimidating. "You wouldn't mind, Sarah Porter. It would be my pleasure to escort you." He tipped his hat with an exaggerated flourish that made her laugh, a sound that came more easily these days, but still held the power to surprise her. "Well, when you put it that way, Mr. Young, how could a lady refuse?" The festival exceeded Sarah's modest expectations. Her table of handcrafted goods, embroidered handkerchiefs, baby bonnets, and delicate lace collars attracted steady interest throughout the day. She sold nearly everything she had brought, earning more money in one afternoon than she typically made in 2 weeks of laundry work. More surprising than the financial success, however, was how much she enjoyed being part of the community celebration. People she knew only as customers stopped to chat, not about her loss or her status as a widow, but about everyday matters: the weather, the quality of this year's corn crop, the scandalous new fashions reported in the ladies' magazines that occasionally made their way to Bandera. Xavier kept his promise, checking on her regularly throughout the day, bringing her lemonade when the heat grew intense, and subtly steering away the few busybodies who seemed inclined to pry into her personal affairs. By late afternoon, when most of her goods had been sold, he appeared at her table with a proposition. "They're about to start the dancing," he said, nodding toward the center of town where men were clearing a space and setting up platforms for the musicians. "Would you care to join in?" Sarah hesitated. She hadn't danced since before Thomas died, and the thought of public merriment still felt somehow transgressive in light of her more recent loss. And yet, the lively fiddle music starting up stirred something in her that had been dormant for too long. "I'm not sure I remember how," she said, which wasn't quite a refusal. Xavier's smile warmed his eyes. "Some things the body doesn't forget." He held out his hand. "One dance. If you don't enjoy it, we'll stop." Sarah looked at his outstretched hand, then back to his face, open, patient, without pressure or expectation. She placed her palm in his. "One dance." The musicians had struck up a lively reel, and couples were already forming sets in the cleared area. Xavier led Sarah to the edge of the dancing ground, positioning them in the last row where they wouldn't be too conspicuous. Sarah's heart pounded as the dance began, partly from nervousness and partly from the simple thrill of Xavier's hand on the small of her back as he guided her through the opening movements. To her surprise, her body did remember. After a few tentative steps, muscle memory took over, and she found herself moving with increasing confidence through the patterns of the dance. Xavier was an unexpectedly graceful partner for such a tall man, leading with subtle pressure and anticipating her movements as if they had danced together 100 times before. When the music ended, Sarah was flushed and breathless, but smiling in a way she hadn't in months. "Another?" Xavier asked, and this time she didn't hesitate. They danced 3 more reels and a waltz, stopping only when the sun began to set and lanterns were lit around the square. Sarah's feet ached pleasantly, and she felt lighter than she had since the day she lost her baby. As they walked toward the refreshment tables, Sarah became aware of eyes following them and whispers behind raised hands. She stiffened slightly, the familiar discomfort of being the subject of town gossip creeping over her. Xavier noticed immediately. "Ignore them," he said quietly. "People will always talk. Doesn't mean you have to listen." "It's not just me they're talking about now," she replied, equally low. "It's you as well. Xavier Young, the confirmed bachelor, spending time with the widow Porter. Let them talk." His voice held a hard edge she'd rarely heard from him. "I choose my own company, and I'm proud to be seen with you, Sarah." The simple declaration warmed her more than the most elaborate compliment could have. Still, she couldn't help asking, "Why have you never married, Xavier? A man like you must have had opportunities." They had reached a quieter corner of the square, away from the main festivities. Xavier handed her a cup of punch before answering. "There was someone once, Emily Cartwright. We were to be married when I returned from school in St. Louis." His expression grew distant. "While I was away, there was an outbreak of typhoid fever. She was one of the first to fall ill." "Oh, Xavier, I'm sorry." Sarah felt a pang of guilt for bringing up what was clearly a painful memory. He shook his head slightly. "It was a long time ago. I was 19, thought my world had ended." He looked at her directly. "I understand grief, Sarah. I know how it can hollow you out, make you think you'll never feel whole again." "And do you?" she asked. "Feel whole again?" He considered this carefully. "Most days." There are still moments when something reminds me of her and it catches me by surprise. But the pain isn't what it was. He set his empty cup aside. Time doesn't heal all wounds, no matter what people say, but it does change them into something you can carry without breaking under the weight. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching the dancers swirl under the lantern light. Then Xavier spoke again, his voice different somehow, more careful, more deliberate. "Sarah, there's something I've been wanting to tell you." Before he could continue, they were interrupted by William Baker, the owner of the general store and one of Bandera's leading citizens. "Young, there you are, been looking all over for you." He nodded politely to Sarah. "Mrs. Porter, you're looking well this evening." "Mr. Baker," she acknowledged with a slight inclination of her head. "Sorry to interrupt, but there's a matter I need to discuss with Young here. Ranch business. Won't take but a minute." Xavier looked torn, glancing between Sarah and the storekeeper. "Can it wait until tomorrow, Baker?" "I was in the middle of, I'm afraid not. Concerns that heard you're bringing up from the border next week. There's been some complications." Sarah touched Xavier's arm lightly. "It's all right. I should be getting home soon anyway. It's been a long day." "I'll walk you home as soon as I'm done," Xavier promised. "Wait for me," she agreed, and he reluctantly followed Baker toward the makeshift business offices that had been set up in the schoolhouse for the duration of the festival. Sarah found herself a comfortable seat on a bench beneath a large oak tree, content to watch the ongoing festivities while she waited. She was so absorbed in her own thoughts that she didn't notice Viola Simmons approaching until the woman's floral perfume announced her presence. Viola, the unmarried daughter of Bandera's most prosperous rancher, was known for her beauty, her expensive taste in clothing ordered directly from San Antonio, and her sharp tongue. "Mrs. Porter," Viola said, her voice sweet as honey but with an undercurrent that immediately put Sarah on guard. "How lovely to see you out and about. You've been quite the recluse since your unfortunate incident." Sarah straightened her spine. "Miss Simmons, are you enjoying the festival?" "Oh, immensely." Viola sat uninvited beside Sarah, arranging her elaborate skirts with practiced precision. "Though not nearly as much as you seem to be. You and Xavier Young have been the talk of the gathering." Sarah kept her expression neutral. "Mr. Young has been kind enough to assist me since my loss. I'm grateful for his friendship." Viola's perfectly arched eyebrows rose. "Friendship? Is that what they're calling it these days? My dear, the man has been at your cabin more often than he's been at his own bunkhouse these past months." "I don't see how that's anyone's concern but ours," Sarah replied, her voice cooling several degrees. "Perhaps not," Viola conceded with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Though I would have thought a woman in your position would be more circumspect, especially given the circumstances of your arrival in Bandera, alone, claiming widowhood, then suddenly with child." She paused delicately. "Some might wonder about the timing." Sarah felt a flush of anger rising up her neck. "My husband died in the Twin Lakes mine collapse. There were 37 casualties. You're welcome to verify it with the Colorado territorial records." Viola waved this away as if it were an insignificant detail. "Oh, I'm sure everything is quite proper in that regard. I only mention it because Xavier Young is highly regarded in this community. His father was one of the founding members of the Cattlemen's Association, you know. The Young name carries weight." "I'm aware of Xavier's standing," Sarah said stiffly. "Then you must also be aware that there are certain expectations regarding who a man in his position might court." Viola leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Between us, my father has had an understanding with James Cross for years now. When Xavier proves himself capable of running the Cross T without supervision, the ranch will be his along with my hand, naturally." The revelation hit Sarah with the force of a physical blow. She struggled to maintain her composure, unwilling to give Viola the satisfaction of seeing her distress. If there is such an understanding, perhaps you should be having this conversation with Xavier. Viola's laugh tinkled like glass breaking. Men can be so easily distracted by a pretty face and a sad story, but Xavier is practical above all else. He knows where his future lies. She stood, brushing imaginary dust from her elaborate bustle. I simply thought you deserved to know, woman to woman. I would hate to see you invest your emotions unwisely. Again. With that parting shot, Viola glided away into the crowd, leaving Sarah feeling as though she'd been doused with cold water. Could it be true? She knew that James Cross, owner of the Cross Tea, had no sons of his own. It made sense that he would be grooming Xavier to take over eventually. And an alliance with the wealthy Simmons family would certainly be advantageous for the ranch. She thought back over the past months, examining every interaction with Xavier in this new, harsh light. Had she misread his kindness as something more? Had she allowed herself to hope for a future that was never possible by the time Xavier returned from his meeting with Baker? Sarah had worked herself into such a state of confusion and hurt that she could barely look at him. "Sorry that took so long," he said, clearly oblivious to her turmoil. "Baker's been hearing rumors about rustlers near the border, wanted to warn me before next week's cattle drive." He peered at her face in the dim light. "Sarah, what's wrong?" "Nothing. I'm just tired." She stood, gathering her shawl around her shoulders despite the warm evening. "I think I should go home now." Xavier studied her, concern evident in his features. "Did something happen while I was gone?" "No." The lie felt bitter on her tongue. "As I said, I'm tired. It's been a long day." He nodded slowly, clearly not believing her but unwilling to press. "I'll walk you home then." The journey back to Sarah's cabin was made in uncomfortable silence. Xavier tried several times to revive the easy conversation they'd enjoyed earlier, but Sarah responded with one-word answers or noncommittal sounds. By the time they reached her door, the tension between them was palpable. "Sarah," Xavier said as she fumbled with her key, "whatever's bothering you, I wish you'd tell me. I can't fix what I don't understand." She turned to face him, the moonlight casting his features in silver and shadow. "Not everything can be fixed, Xavier. Some things simply are what they are." He stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "What things?" "Reality, expectations, the future." She looked up at him, steeling herself against the concern in his eyes. "Viola Simmons told me about your arrangement with her father and Mr. Cross." Understanding dawned on Xavier's face, followed quickly by anger. "Viola Simmons has an overactive imagination and a spiteful tongue. She said there's an understanding, that when you prove yourself capable of running the Cross Tea, you'll inherit the ranch and marry her." Sarah's voice remained steady, though it cost her dearly. "Is it true?" Xavier ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "There was talk of such an arrangement years ago, before I went to St. Louis. James Cross and Simmons were friends, both wanted to consolidate their holdings eventually. But that was their plan, not mine. And you never agreed to it." "I was 17, Sarah. No one asked my opinion. After Emily died and I came back from school, I told Cross I had no interest in marrying Viola or anyone else at that time. He understood. And now?" The question came out barely above a whisper. Xavier reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, and took her hand in his. "Now I'm a grown man who makes his own choices, and Viola Simmons isn't one of them." Relief flooded through Sarah, making her knees weak. "I shouldn't have listened to her. I'm sorry." "Don't be. She knew exactly what she was doing, trying to drive a wedge between us." His thumb traced circles on the back of her hand. The question is, why does it matter to you who I might or might not marry? The directness of the question caught Sarah off guard. She could feel a blush rising to her cheeks and was grateful for the concealing darkness. I care about you, Xavier. You've been a good friend to me during the worst time of my life. A friend. He said the word carefully, testing it. Is that all I am to you, Sarah? Her heart hammered in her chest. 6 months ago, she had been a pregnant widow, focused only on survival and the child she carried. The idea of romantic feelings for another man would have seemed impossible, even disloyal to her unborn baby. But now, I don't know what I feel anymore, she admitted. Everything has been so confused since I lost the baby. Sometimes I think I'm finally healing, moving forward, and then guilt crashes over me like a wave. She looked down at their joined hands. And when I'm with you, I feel alive again. And that scares me almost as much as the grief did. Xavier's other hand came up to gently tilt her chin until she was looking at him. There's no timetable for grief, Sarah. No rules about when you're allowed to feel joy again. Remember what I told you that first day. Grieve as long as needed. Not as long as others think you should, or as long as you think you should punish yourself. As long as needed. Tears welled in her eyes. And what if I'm not sure what I need? Then you take each day as it comes, and you remember you don't have to face them alone. His eyes searched hers in the moonlight. Unless you want to. I don't, she whispered. Want to be alone, that is. The confession hung in the air between them, fraught with meaning. Xavier's gaze dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes, asking a silent question. Sarah answered by rising slightly on her toes, closing the distance between them. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, as if Xavier feared she might shatter under his touch. Then Sarah's arms wound around his neck, pulling him closer, and the kiss deepened into something hungry and needful. His hands spanned her waist, strong and sure, anchoring her as she felt herself being swept away by sensations she'd almost forgotten existed. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Sarah felt lightheaded and strangely powerful all at once. Xavier rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed as if savoring the moment. I've been wanting to do that for months, he confessed softly. Sarah's lips curved in a smile. Why didn't you? Wasn't sure you were ready. Wasn't sure you'd welcome it from me. His eyes opened, serious again. I don't want to rush you, Sarah. I know your heart's still healing. She traced the line of his jaw with her fingertips, marveling at the contrast between the roughness of his stubble and the tenderness in his expression. Maybe healing isn't something that happens before living begins again. Maybe they happen together. Xavier captured her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. Then we'll take it one day at a time. No expectations, no pressure. His smile held promise. Just us figuring it out together. As autumn painted the hill country in golds and reds, Sarah and Xavier's relationship deepened and evolved. They moved cautiously at first, both wary of the fragile thing growing between them. Xavier continued his daily visits, but now they often ended with lingering kisses on the porch as the sun set behind the hills. They spoke of their pasts more freely, Xavier sharing stories of his childhood at the cross T, Sarah revealing the dreams she'd once had of becoming a teacher before marriage to Thomas had set her on a different path. The townsfolk of Bandera noticed the change, of course. Some, like Hannah Miller, expressed quiet approval. Others, Viola Simmons chief among them, made their disapproval equally clear. Sarah found, somewhat to her surprise, that she cared far less about public opinion than she once had. Grief had a way of putting such concerns into perspective. One crisp October afternoon, Xavier arrived at Sarah's cabin with an unusual request. "Ride with me," he said, holding the reins of not one but two horses. "There's something I want to show you." Sarah eyed the second mount, a gentle-looking bay mare with trepidation. "I haven't been on a horse in years. Buttercup here is steady as they come," Xavier assured her. "Old Cross bought her for his niece, but the girl was too scared to ride. She'll take good care of you." Something in his expression, a mixture of excitement and nervousness, convinced Sarah to agree. She changed into her sturdiest skirt, borrowed a pair of Xavier's leather gloves that engulfed her small hands, and allowed him to help her mount. After a few tentative circles around her yard to reacquaint herself with the feeling, Sarah nodded her readiness. Xavier led them west, away from town and into the rolling landscape of the hill country. They rode in comfortable silence for nearly an hour, following game trails through stands of live oak and cypress, crossing shallow streams where late-blooming wildflowers still dotted the banks. The rhythmic movement of the horse beneath her and the crisp autumn air filled Sarah with a sense of freedom she hadn't experienced in a very long time. Finally, they crested a gentle rise, and Xavier reined in his horse. "We're here," he said, dismounting and coming to help Sarah down. Here was a small plateau overlooking a winding creek, with views extending for miles across the undulating Texas landscape. A massive oak tree stood sentinel at one edge, its sprawling branches creating a natural canopy. The grass was thick and green, dotted with late wildflowers. "It's beautiful," Sarah said, turning slowly to take in the panoramic view. "I had no idea this was here. Not many people do." Xavier took her hand and led her to the oak tree. "My father brought me here when I was a boy," said his father showed it to him when he first came to Texas. 3 generations of young men have stood on this spot. There was something in his voice, a current of emotion that made Sarah look at him more closely. "It's special to you," he nodded, his eyes scanning the horizon. "This land gets in your blood, becomes part of who you are." He turned to face her directly. "That's what I was trying to tell you the night of the festival before Baker interrupted us." "Tell me what?" Sarah asked, though something in her already knew, could feel it in the suddenly charged air between them. "James Cross is retiring. Moving to San Antonio to live with his sister. He's offering me the chance to buy the Cross tea." Sarah's eyes widened. "Xavier, that's wonderful news. But can you afford it?" He smiled, clearly pleased by her immediate understanding of what the opportunity meant to him. "Cross is being more than fair with the terms. My father left me some money I've never touched, and I've saved most of my wages over the years. It'll be tight for a while, but yes, I can manage it. I'm so happy for you." And she was, genuinely, though a small part of her wondered what this change would mean for them. The Cross tea was a large operation, demanding its owner's full attention. Would Xavier still have time for her once he took on such responsibility? As if reading her thoughts, Xavier took both her hands in his. "The thing is, Sarah, I don't want to do it alone." His voice was steady, but she could feel a slight tremor in his fingers. "The ranch house is too big for one person. Always has been." Sarah's breath caught as understanding dawned. "Xavier, I'm not asking out of convenience or because I think you need taking care of," he said quickly. "The truth is, I've fallen in love with you, Sarah Porter. Your strength, your kindness, the way you faced unimaginable loss with such grace." He squeezed her hands gently. "I know it hasn't been long, and I know you're still healing. If you're not ready, I understand. But I wanted you to know where I stand." Tears blurred Sarah's vision, but these were different from the tears of grief she'd shed so often in recent months. These were born of a joy so unexpected, so complete that it almost frightened her. "I love you too," she whispered, the words feeling both momentous and entirely natural. "I think I have for a while now, but I was afraid to admit it, even to myself." Xavier's face lit up with such hope that it nearly broke her heart. "Does that mean?" "Yes," she said, laughing through her tears. "Yes, I'll marry you, Xavier Young." He pulled her into his arms then, lifting her off her feet in an exuberant embrace that made her laugh out loud. When he set her down, his expression grew serious again. "You're sure? I don't want to rush you," if Sarah silenced him with a kiss. "I'm sure," she said when they finally broke apart. "Life is too uncertain, too precious to waste when you know what you want." She looked around at the beautiful vista before them. "Is this to be our land, then?" Xavier nodded. "The cross T stretches from here all the way back to the edge of your property. That's another reason I brought you here today." He hesitated. "There's something else I want to show you." He led her to the other side of the great oak tree. There, nestled in a natural hollow of the massive trunk, was a small wooden cross, weathered with age. "My mother lost a child between me and my sister," Xavier said quietly. "A little boy who lived less than a day. My father brought him here, said he should rest in the most beautiful place on their land." He looked at Sarah uncertainly. "I thought, if you wanted, we could place a marker for your baby here too, so she'd always be part of this place, part of our family." Sarah stared at the simple wooden cross, emotion welling up too powerful for words. The thoughtfulness of the gesture acknowledging her loss, honoring the child she would never know, including that child in their future together, broke through the last barriers around her heart. She threw her arms around Xavier, burying her face in his chest as tears came once more. But these tears felt cleansing rather than devastating, a release rather than a drowning. "Yes," she said when she could speak again. "I'd like that very much." The next morning, they returned to the hilltop with tools and materials. Together, they crafted a small marker of cedar wood, and Sarah carefully carved the name Elizabeth into its surface. They placed it beside the older cross, under the spreading branches of the ancient oak. Sarah knelt beside the marker, placing a small bouquet of late autumn wildflowers before it. "I'll always love you," she whispered to the child who had never drawn breath, "and I'll always carry you with me." She touched the marker gently. "But I'm going to live now, really live. I think that's what you would want for me." Xavier stood a respectful distance away, giving her space for this private moment. When she finally rose and came to him, he wrapped an arm around her shoulders. They stood together, looking out over what would soon be their land, their home, their future. "Ready?" he asked after a long, peaceful silence. Sarah nodded, feeling lighter than she had in months. "Ready." They were married 2 weeks later in Bandera's small church, with Hannah and Dr. Miller as witnesses. Sarah wore a simple blue dress she had sewn herself, with lace at the collar and cuffs. Xavier, looking somewhat uncomfortable in his Sunday best, couldn't take his eyes off her throughout the brief ceremony. The reception at the Cross T Ranch house was a small affair by local standards, just 30 or so guests from the town and neighboring ranches. Notable by her absence was Viola Simmons, though her father attended briefly, offering stiff congratulations before departing early. James Cross, on the other hand, seemed genuinely pleased with the match, telling anyone who would listen that Xavier had finally shown some sense in choosing a wife with practical skills and a level head. Sarah found herself unexpectedly emotional as she was introduced to each room of what would now be her home. The ranch house was indeed large, 8 rooms in all, with a wide covered porch wrapping around 3 sides and tall windows that filled the spaces with light. It was more than she had ever imagined possessing, and for a moment she felt overwhelmed by the responsibility. "It's a lot to take in," Xavier said, noticing her expression as they stood alone in what would be their bedroom. The guests were still celebrating downstairs, but he had brought her up to show her the changes he'd made: new curtains, a larger bed, a dressing table he'd had made by the local carpenter. "It's wonderful," Sarah assured him quickly. I'm just not used to so much space." Xavier smiled understandingly. "We'll make it our own little by little." He came to stand behind her, his hands resting lightly on her shoulders. "I was thinking the room across the hall might make a good nursery. Someday, when you're ready." Sarah turned in his arms, heart full at his careful consideration of her feelings. "I'd like that. Not right away, perhaps, but someday." The winter of 1878 into 1879 was unusually cold for Texas, with ice storms that coated the landscape in crystalline beauty, but brought challenges for the cattle. Xavier worked long hours alongside his ranch hands, ensuring the animals had access to feed and unfrozen water. Sarah threw herself into her role as mistress of the Cross T, managing the household, learning to cook for hungry cowhands, and continuing her sewing work, which had become increasingly in demand following the festival. Despite the demands of running the ranch, Xavier made time each day to be with Sarah, even if it was just sharing coffee before dawn or reading together by the fire in the evenings. Their love grew deeper with each passing day, built on a foundation of mutual respect and understanding that neither had experienced in previous relationships. In February, during a rare snowfall that blanketed the hill country, Xavier took Sarah back to their special place on the plateau. They rode bundled in heavy coats and scarves, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The oak tree stood majestic against the white landscape, its massive branches dusted with snow, the two small crosses at its base barely visible. Sarah dismounted, going immediately to check on Elizabeth's marker. She brushed away the snow gently, tracing the carved name with her gloved finger. Xavier joined her, kneeling beside her in the snow. "I've been thinking about what you said," Sarah told him, her voice soft in the winter stillness. "About the nursery, about someday." She looked up at him, snowflakes catching in her eyelashes. "I think I'm ready for someday to be soon." Xavier's face registered surprise, then joy. "Are you sure?" She nodded, her heart certain. "Having another child won't replace Elizabeth, nothing ever could. But I think there's room in my heart now for new love." She reached for his hand. "Our love has taught me that." That night, in their warm bed while snow continued to fall outside, Sarah and Xavier came together with a tenderness and passion that spoke of new beginnings and enduring hope. As she lay in his arms afterward, Sarah felt a sense of peace that had once seemed unreachable in the depths of her grief. "Thank you," she whispered against his chest. "For what?" he asked, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "For sitting with me in silence that day. For giving me permission to grieve as long as I needed." She raised herself on one elbow to look into his eyes. "For believing I would find my way back to life again." Xavier tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his expression solemn. "You did the hard part, Sarah. I just had the good sense to wait for you." Spring arrived early in 1879, transforming the hill country into a riot of color as bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush carpeted the meadows. The ranch thrived under Xavier's management, with a successful calving season that promised prosperity for the year ahead. Sarah's sewing business had grown to the point that she now employed 2 young women from town to help fulfill orders that came from as far away as San Antonio. By May, there was no denying the slight rounding of Sarah's abdomen beneath her dresses. She and Xavier had kept the news private, sharing it only with Dr. and Hannah Miller until Sarah was well into her 4th month. "Everything looks excellent, Mrs. Young," Dr. Miller assured her after an examination in early June. "Strong heartbeat, good size. You're carrying this baby exactly as you should be." Still, Sarah couldn't help the fear that sometimes gripped her, especially at night when doubts crept in like thieves. What if something went wrong again? What if her body simply wasn't meant to carry a child to term? Xavier seemed to sense when these fears overtook her, holding her close and reminding her that each pregnancy was different, that they would face whatever came together. In July, they rode once more to the oak tree on the plateau. Now a regular pilgrimage they made to honor Elizabeth's memory and mark the passing seasons. The summer heat was intense, but a gentle breeze stirred the leaves above them as they sat in the dappled shade. Sarah's back against Xavier's chest, his hands resting protectively over the now obvious swell of her belly. "I felt movement yesterday," Sarah told him, guiding his hand to a spot just below her ribs. "Like butterfly wings at first, then stronger." Xavier's expression of wonder when he felt the baby kick against his palm brought tears to Sarah's eyes. "That's our child," he said, voice filled with awe. "Our son or daughter." "Our future," Sarah agreed, leaning back into his embrace. She looked over at Elizabeth's marker, now weathered to match the older cross beside it. "I used to worry that being happy again, loving you, wanting this baby, I worried it meant I was forgetting her. And now?" Xavier asked gently. Sarah smiled, a bittersweet curve of her lips. "Now I understand that remembering doesn't have to mean remaining in grief. She'll always be my first child, always have a special place in my heart. But loving her doesn't mean I can't also embrace joy when it comes." They stayed there until the sun began to set, talking about their hopes for the baby, making plans for the future. As they prepared to leave, Sarah placed a small bunch of wildflowers at the base of Elizabeth's marker, as she always did. "Your little brother or sister is coming soon," she said softly. "I'll make sure they know about you. You'll never be forgotten, my sweet girl." The summer heat gave way to the milder days of autumn, and Sarah's pregnancy progressed without complication. Still, as she entered her 8th month, both she and Xavier grew increasingly anxious. This was when she had lost Elizabeth, and though Dr. Miller continued to assure them that everything was proceeding normally, neither could quite banish the fear that history might repeat itself. Xavier insisted on hiring additional help for the ranch house, bringing in Mrs. Abernathy, a widow from town, to assist with cooking and cleaning so Sarah could rest more. He also arranged for Hannah Miller to stay at the ranch during the final weeks of Sarah's pregnancy, a comfort for which Sarah was deeply grateful. As her time drew near, Sarah found herself spending quiet hours in the nursery, running her hands over the cradle Xavier had crafted, folding and refolding tiny clothes, some new and some salvaged from those she had made for Elizabeth. It was in this room, surrounded by preparations for new life, that she finally made complete peace with her loss. "I'll always love you," she whispered to the memory of the child who never was, "but now I need to make room in my heart for your sibling. I think you'd understand that." On a clear, cold day in early December, Sarah felt the first contractions while helping Mrs. Abernathy prepare supper. Unlike the sudden, violent onset of her miscarriage, these pains built gradually, rhythmically, in a way that felt right despite their intensity. "It's time," she told Xavier when he came in from the barn, her voice steady despite the nervousness fluttering in her chest. The labor was long, nearly 18 hours from the first pains to the final, powerful contractions. Throughout it all, Xavier remained by her side, supporting her, encouraging her, his faith in her strength never wavering even when hers did. Hannah Miller and the doctor worked efficiently together, their calm presence reassuring during the most difficult moments. Just as dawn broke over the hill country, casting golden light through the bedroom window, their son entered the world with a lusty cry that brought tears of joy to both parents' eyes. "He's perfect," Dr. Miller announced, placing the swaddled infant in Sarah's arms after cleaning and examining him. "Strong lungs, good color, all fingers and toes accounted for. Sarah stared down at the tiny face, overcome with emotion so powerful it seemed to physically expand her chest. The baby had Xavier's dark hair and strong features, but when he blinked up at her, she saw her own gray eyes looking back. "Hello, William," she whispered, using the name they had chosen months ago to honor the child she had carried but never held. "We've been waiting for you." Xavier sat on the edge of the bed, one arm around Sarah's shoulders, the other hand gently touching his son's cheek with a finger that seemed enormous compared to the infant's delicate features. "You did it," he said, voice thick with emotion. "You're incredible, Sarah." Later, when mother and baby had rested and the Millers had gone home with promises to return the next day, Xavier brought something into the bedroom, a small wooden box, beautifully crafted and polished to a soft glow. "What's this?" Sarah asked, looking up from nursing William. "Something I've been working on for a while." Xavier set the box on the bed beside her and opened the lid. Inside, nestled in soft cloth, was a silver locket on a delicate chain. "May I?" Sarah nodded, and Xavier carefully fastened the necklace around her neck. The oval locket rested just above her heart, warm against her skin. "Open it," he urged softly. Inside were two tiny compartments. On one side was a small lock of dark hair William's, taken after his first bath. The other side was empty. "I thought," Xavier said hesitantly, "that you might want to put something there for Elizabeth. A piece of the ribbon from the dress you were making for her, perhaps, or a pressed flower from the oak tree. Something to keep both your children close to your heart." Sarah touched the locket, tears spilling onto her cheeks. "It's perfect," she whispered. "Absolutely perfect." In the years that followed, the Young family flourished along with the Cross T Ranch. William grew into a sturdy, curious boy with his father's quiet strength and his mother's determination. 2 years after his birth, he was joined by a sister, Catherine, whose arrival was greeted with joy uncomplicated by fear. Each spring, the family made a pilgrimage to the oak tree on the plateau, bringing flowers for Elizabeth's marker and sharing stories about her with the children as they grew old enough to understand. Sarah wanted them to know about their sister who lived only in their mother's womb, to understand that love doesn't end with loss, and that grief, given enough time and tenderness, can transform into something that enriches rather than diminishes life. On William's 5th birthday, as they gathered under the oak tree for a special family picnic, Xavier presented his son with a small carved horse, crafted from the same cedar wood as Elizabeth's marker. "This is how we remember those we love," he explained as the boy examined the gift with solemn eyes. "We create things that last, things that tell their story." Sarah watched from a few steps away, Catherine balanced on her hip, the silver locket that never left her neck catching the sunlight as it filtered through the oak leaves. The locket now held 2 treasures: William's baby hair on one side, and on the other, a tiny square of fabric from the baby gown Sarah had been sewing when she lost Elizabeth. "Are you happy, Mama?" William asked, coming to lean against her skirts, his new wooden horse clutched tightly in one hand. Sarah looked around at her family. Xavier, solid and loving, his hair now showing traces of silver at the temples. William, growing so fast she could hardly keep him in clothes. Catherine, with her father's blue eyes and her mother's dimpled smile. And in her heart, Elizabeth, a presence that had once been only pain but now was something more complex and beautiful, a reminder of how precious and precarious life could be, and how essential it was to embrace joy when it came. "Yes, my darling," she answered, bending to kiss the top of his head. "I am very, very happy." That night, after the children were asleep and the ranch house had settled into peaceful quiet, Sarah and Xavier sat together on the porch swing, watching the stars emerge in the vast Texas sky. His arm was around her shoulders, her head rested against his chest, their hearts beating in a rhythm that had synchronized over their years together. "You ever think about that day?" Sarah asked softly. "When you found me on the floor of my cabin?" Xavier's arm tightened slightly around her. "Sometimes. Not as often as I used to. I thought my life was over," she confessed. "I couldn't imagine ever feeling anything but that terrible emptiness. I remember." His voice was gentle with the memory. "You looked so small, so broken. All I knew was that I couldn't leave you alone like that." Sarah turned her face up to his, the silver light of the moon illuminating the fine lines that time and weather had etched around his eyes, the strong features that had become as familiar to her as her own reflection. "You told me to grieve as long as needed. You gave me permission to feel that pain fully, without rushing me to get over it as so many others did. It wasn't wisdom," Xavier said with a slight shrug. "Just seemed like the right thing to say. It was exactly what I needed to hear." She reached up to touch his face, tracing the line of his jaw with tender fingers. "You saved me that day, Xavier Young, not by trying to fix what couldn't be fixed, but by sitting with me in my darkest hour and believing I would find my way back to light again." "You saved yourself, Sarah," he corrected gently. "I just had the good sense to wait for you, and the great fortune that you chose to build a new life that included me." Sarah smiled, thinking of how far they had come from that terrible day, the joy they had created together, the family they had built, the love that had grown from the ashes of loss. "Well then," she said, settling back against his chest, "I'm grateful we saved each other." Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, bearing witness to a love that had begun in grief, but blossomed into something enduring and beautiful. And in the distance, on a plateau overlooking their land, the oak tree stood sentinel over two small markers, one weathered by years, one still relatively new, silent testimony to the truth that Sarah had learned through pain and joy, that loss and love could coexist in the same heart, and that sometimes the deepest happinesses are those that come after the greatest sorrows.